These days, positively charged toxic EMF are everywhere, but your biofield runs on a negative charge just like your body's cells, so how do you protect it? I've been using organ effects products like the GeoCleanse and Enaband for years because their technology addresses what others don't, that is, the subtle, toxic positive charge field of harmful EMF, neutralising it. Head to brendanmurphy.global/EMF to learn more and get yours, and enter Murphy at checkout for 10% off. All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this episode of Truthiverse. This week, I'm joined by Professor Patrick Nunn, who is, as I said, a professor at the University of the Sunshine Coast on the lovely sunny coast of Australia, professor of geology, if I'm not mistaken, as well. And I have read some interesting work by Patrick, and he's been doing some very interesting work around the oral traditions of indigenous peoples and the documentation, the verbal documentation or recording of the sea levels rising and these types of huge, even catastrophic events down through thousands of years, and researching whether or not the tales and so-called myths are actually based in reality and verifiable. So with that said, Patrick, we're going to dive into that. Thank you so much for taking the time to have a chat.
It's a real pleasure, Brendan. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah. I meant to book this with Patrick months ago, ladies and gents, so it's my fault that it didn't happen a bit sooner, but we made it. So Patrick, can you tell me, just to give us a bit of background, so you're a professor of geology, what is, just in a nutshell, what is your background and how did you get into studying this particular subject?
Okay, well, I'm from the UK originally. I have a PhD in sort of geography, geology. It's kind of at the interface. And then after I got my PhD, I knew I wanted to work in a university, and there weren't any jobs in the UK at the time. So I thought, okay, I'll apply for this job at the University of the South Pacific in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and I'll go out there for 3 years and go back to the UK and follow a fairly predictable pathway for the rest of my life. But I ended up going to the University of the South Pacific, which serves 12 different Pacific Island countries, and staying there for 25 years, and never really going back to live in the UK. And I think what actually got me around to where I am today, I mean, I'm a conventionally trained geologist and climate scientist. I've worked a lot with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, for more than 20 years now. And I think what brought me to what we're going to talk about today is the fact that when I lived in the Pacific Islands, I met people who not only could not speak English or could not write English, but couldn't read or write. And I don't say that in a kind of judgmental way, because the impact of meeting those people and hearing what they had in their heads that they could recall and that they could explain in a kind of organized and rational way was quite mind-blowing to me. It had never occurred to me that people could hold that amount of information in their heads in a well-organized way, and be able to relate it at will. And that really gave me a profound respect for oral traditions and for oral knowledges, if you like. And it also made it clear to me, I think, how much literacy has damaged that very, very long human legacy, the legacy of all of our ancestors who passed knowledge down for thousands and thousands of years orally, and most of that has been lost today. So, look, to cut a long story short, then I moved to Australia in 2010 and became exposed to indigenous Australian or Aboriginal stories, some of which I think we can demonstrate fairly convincingly must have endured for more than 7,000 or 8,000 years. So it's that's brought me to this present situation.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So the encountering of these people who had this phenomenal, memory recall, it must have been kind of like encountering one of the bards of yore. They would memorize these vast amounts of verse and just insane amounts of information and be able to repeat it back in a way that we now don't really seem to have that capacity, because we outsource it to computers and books, and we write it down so that we can forget about it.
Precisely.
Is that where you started encountering? Is that where you started encountering these types of these stories, and that's what piqued your interest, was the fact that the so-called natives or the indigenous peoples had these traditions that really defied a conventional kind of academic view, and you took it seriously, obviously.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. And look, I wasn't converted in an instant by any means. I think I grew up and I was trained with all the prejudices that literate people have against illiterate people. That illiteracy is a condition that needs to be rectified by making someone literate. And I'm not saying that's not a worthy objective, of course, in particular contexts. But I think what I am saying is that, it really brought home to me what I've called since in my writings the tyranny of literacy, the idea that literate people subordinate knowledge that is not written down, and you're absolutely right. We outsource everything today, and even myself, and I'm a bit older than you, but when I was young, I used to pride myself on the fact I could remember maybe 20 or 30 phone numbers in my head, the important ones. And you could remember your grandparents' birthdays and things like that because that's what you did. But I say to my students today, no one, how many phone numbers do you know? I mean, you probably don't know any because you just go to speed dial and press a name, and how many birthdays do you know? You don't know any because, your calendar reminders sort of pop up a week before. So you know to call granddad on a particular day. So you're absolutely right. We've outsourced all these things, but that doesn't mean that our ancestors were the same. And it became absolutely clear to me, Brendan, that people in those kinds of context had, and in some cases still have, an immense capacity to store and relate knowledge. And if I could just if you could just indulge me for another
Please.
30 seconds.
Please.
I remember that, one of the first people that I met like this, he was called Michaeli Samu. And we sat down with him one evening at about 7 o'clock in the evening, and we asked him to tell us a few stories. And I thought, okay, well, we'll be out of here by 8:30. We were out of there at about 3 o'clock in the morning, and he was still going. He was so happy to be telling these stories. And there was no repetition. It was stories about where his people had lived before, about the places that they'd known and the incidents that had taken there, and who had married who, and who had invaded who, and who had encountered who, and what happened, and stories about great fishing expeditions and all these kinds of things. But it was all there, and he knew it all, and it was all incredibly coherent and impressive. It was like reading a novel in a night.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to meet anybody like that. So were you struck by the level of the intergenerational fidelity of these stories, and that from generation to generation were preserved with relatively high levels of integrity, like so much so that you were able in your work to actually go back to the geology and the geography and go, oh, this is true.
Yes, yeah. I think that's correct. I mean, we can talk about Australia later because I think that's where the best examples of all of this come from. But just to stay with the Pacific for a minute, I have a doctoral student who's just finishing her research, and she and I went to this island in southern Fiji called Kondavu, and about 2,500 years ago on Kondavu, a volcano erupted, and it was a big volcano. You can still see the mountain there today. It's called Nambukulevu, and we went from village to village on this quite large volcanic island. We went to about 13 or 14 different communities. And in each of those communities, they had a story about the eruption of that volcano 2,500 years ago. And once we'd got over our initial surprise that they still had a story that had lasted 2,500 years, we started to analyze the differences in the stories in different places. So the people close to the volcanic eruption had a story that was different to people who were further away from the volcanic eruption. And it all makes perfect sense. And so here is a a tradition, a memory of a memorable event, a volcanic eruption that sent out an ash cloud and caused tsunamis and earth shaking and all this kind of thing. Here we have a memory 2,500 years old that's preserved in at least 13 or 14 different contexts on this small island not small, but island in southern Fiji. So I think there's a lot more examples of this kind of thing that are out there, and I'd love to see more research being done on this.
Yeah. And just, I don't want to dwell on it necessarily, but I'm just curious, the dating methods, in the conventional world, like the geological community, the archaeological community, how do they know that the volcano, erupted around about 2,500 years ago?
Yeah, sure. That's something that we can do with a high degree of precision these days. So basically what we're looking at are the products of that volcanic eruption. So whether it was lava or whether it was sort of hot rocks, pyroclastic stuff that was chucked out of the volcano, wherever that stuff landed or wherever it moved across the land, we can look at something underneath, maybe a tree or something like that it went over the top of, and we can extract carbon from the remains of that tree and use radiocarbon dating to determine the age quite precisely. So when I say 2,500 years ago for this particular eruption, it's plus or minus about 50 years. So it's not spot on, but it's within quite a narrow range. So we know that, we know roughly ballpark when that eruption occurred, and therefore how old those memories must be. And that's the critical thing. And the point you made about replication fidelity of these memories is very important, because clearly in each of those 13 or 14 communities, we were able to recognize this story as a memory of a volcanic eruption. Of course, dressed up in a bit of sort of mythological embellishment, a god here getting angry with a god there, and throwing a spear and dropping earth from, baskets when they were flying through the air, all this kind of thing. But once you look past that kind of sufficient information, sufficient detail, then it's absolutely clear what they're talking about. This is a memory of a volcanic eruption. It's not the way we would describe it today, but it is the way that people described it 2,500 years ago, within the framework of their worldview.
Exactly, yeah, and cultures all around the world did that same thing. Like, particularly, the Aboriginal cultures of Australia did the exact same thing. They would dress it up with their versions of the gods, of the animal, the animal gods. This god, the grandmother, this kind of thing, and she did this, they did that, to anthropomorphize their sort of understanding of the events, but record it so that it could be told as a story for a long time later. I'm just curious, do the communities that you were, researching, did they have a concept of like a chronological sense of how far back their own story goes?
No, they didn't. And I think that actually speaks, Brendan, it's a really good question. It speaks to the way that people in other cultures perceive time differently to people in Western cultures. So when we went into these communities, and I said to a few of them, I speak Fijian, I said to a few of them, hey, this story is 2,500 years old. And I expected them to be hugely impressed, but they just shrugged their shoulders and said, yeah, so what? You're not telling us anything we didn't instinctively know. Yeah. But the other thing that's really interesting about time is that one thing that I've found, particularly in Pacific Island communities, and I've been working in Solomon Islands and Vanuatu as well as Fiji recently, with a lot of very traditional communities. And their concept of time is quite different to ours. Not in sort of an immediate sense of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, but in the sense of well, we don't know whether to go and plant this particular crop today. So look, we'll go and consult our ancestors who died 300 years ago. And they'll go off into a special place in the forest, and they'll sit down and they'll talk to their ancestors. And this is not something unusual or uncommon or not something that's scoffed at. It's part and parcel of everyday decision making in these kinds of communities. So not only is time conflated to some degree, but also the the living and the dead are conflated as well, and you see that in a lot of Pacific Island cultures, that death doesn't mean an end in the sense that the person who has died can no longer contribute to the well-being of the community. And look, as a conventionally trained Western scientist, I find this kind of thing absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, well, it's kind of nice to hear you say that rather than dismissing it out of hand, which is what I think most academics tend to do even now, probably to a lesser extent. I mean, you might have you noticed a trend towards becoming more open-minded in that community?
Yeah, I think so. So in 2004, I went to the International Geological Congress in Italy and presented a paper, including one in a session on myth and geology. And it was a controversial session in the sense that the organizers of the International Geological Congress had pushed back against the idea of having a dedicated session on myth and geology. But I can tell you, Brendan, the room was packed for every single session. It was overflowing. There were people crowded in the doorways listening to this. It was such a fascinating topic to most of the geologists who were attending that Congress. And I think you're right. Since then, there has been a sort of lessening of skepticism around others' knowledges and others' worldviews. But there's still, I think, a huge mountain to climb there. A lot of people that I know don't want to have anything to do with this kind of thing. Really, I mean, it's, but they are unduly focused, I think, on their career progression, and they're probably right in that sense. If I was a 25-year-old university lecturer, I probably wouldn't be sticking my neck out and saying some of the things that I do say around this. But I've been in the business now for 30 years, and I just think it's time to sort of tell it as I see it.
Yeah, I respect that a lot, and it's great that we have people doing exactly that. Have you encountered much in the way of pushback, or have you been censored, or I mean, what has it been like? Because this is not, like you've said, this is not a conventional viewpoint at all, and academia tends to be quite hostile towards unconventional points of view. So have you had a lot of pushback?
Personally, not really. No, I don't want to exaggerate this. Yes, of course, there've been one or two and sort of grey-haired professors who I don't think this is really, but I really don't give a stuff. I mean, I've, like I say, I couldn't afford not to work at the moment because I've got a mortgage. So I don't want to lose my job. But at the same time, I'm at a stage in my career where I feel secure enough to say everything that I can support with data. And this is something that I was taught long ago by a lot of the people that mentored me, was that when you're a scientist, you don't go in with preconceived ideas and find data that match your preconceptions. You go in and you find the data and you let the data speak. And this has always been my philosophy, is that you let the data speak. Whatever the data are saying, however radical that may appear, you should, once you've tested everything you can test, allow the data to be foregrounded.
Yeah, and in this case, I would think that particularly the original cultures or nations of Australia would take quite an interest in this and maybe feel quite vindicated in the work that you've produced, because I mean, it's really been quite astonishing in terms of being able to validate, this tradition might be as much as 13,000 years old, an accurate record of geological, landscape changes, all this stuff going back that far. I mean, it's extremely interesting, and I hope that there's the same level of interest in that community as well, because they're their story and their version of their culture has been so suppressed and beat down ever since the original invasion. So I think it's just so valuable, aside from just being really interesting. It's so valuable on multiple levels. Have you had a lot of, I mean, you must have had like a certain level of interface with certain Aboriginal groups in Australia to do this kind of work. Maybe we could touch on that. I mean, I know we're going to get to Australia anyway, but maybe before that, even if you like, we could talk about some of the other areas where you've tracked these interesting stories and changes in the landscape. But I want to let you take it wherever you want to go, because I know there's quite a bit to cover here, and I just think it's really interesting in general. So I'll let you steer the ship.
Well, thank you, Brendan. I mean, the first answer to your first question is that you're absolutely right. Indigenous people, particularly in Australia, have been very welcoming of this kind of research, because it does demonstrate empirically the time depth of their traditions, which they have sensed for a long time. And it's also, I think, demonstrated that their knowledge systems, their worldviews, are as valid as any other worldview, including a Western worldview. And I think that's quite a controversial message. I think that people who are trained in a Western worldview actually find it very, very difficult to relinquish that and start to think about the validity of others' worldviews. But look, then getting on to the second part of what you just said, I mean, before we get to Australia, I mean, let me give you my classic example from the Western United States, which is of Crater Lake in Oregon. And 7,600 years ago, Crater Lake was a massive conical volcano, which we've named Mount Mazama. And it was an active volcano. It came to the end of its active life about 7,600 years ago in a tumultuous explosion. It blew itself to pieces, and the remains of the volcano collapsed into the empty magma chamber under the ground, creating this great depression that we call a caldera, popularly known as a crater. And that became filled with water and became Crater Lake. Now, when the first Europeans got to that area in the 19th century, and they spoke to the Native Americans, the Klamath people who lived there, they heard from many different Klamath sources the story of this eruption, the story of how there had once been a huge mountain there that had collapsed in on itself. A story there's no way around believing has to have been passed down for at least 7,600 years, because, like I say, we can date volcanic eruptions with a high degree of precision. So there's a magnificent example from the Western United States. But I often reflect on that, and I think, well, there were probably dozens of other examples like that. It's simply that the stories weren't recorded in time, and as a result, they have been lost. And it's something I think about a lot. The loss of knowledge, and the fact that really we're just picking up a few crumbs where we can see them, but that when we think about the condition of humanity 300, 400, 500 years ago, the amount of knowledge that people had in their heads that has never been written down was massive, and all that has essentially been lost by the spread of literacy, and of course the privileging of literacy, what I would call the uncritical privileging of literacy. The fact that people assume, well, if it's not written down, it's not worth anything, and if I can't look it up in a book or an encyclopedia or online, then it's not important. And I think that humanity has lost a lot by that.
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about your work is that it turns the idea on its head. The idea that oral traditions are unreliable and the written word is reliable. I mean, you've completely turned it on its head, which is very I mean, I feel good about that. Because for my own personal reasons. But have you looked at all, because I'm living in Mexico at the moment, so we've got like you've got the sort of Aztec and the Mayan cultures or the remnants of them. And is that something you've dug into a lot?
No, I'm afraid not. Um, I grew up in the UK, and I had a Scottish grandmother, and she used to tell me all these stories, these so-called myths and legends from Scotland, and in a tribute to her, in the last year or so, I've done an analysis of Scottish myths and legends about sea rising and land rising and things like that, which has just been published, and I'm really proud of that. And clearly, if I had another sort of 500 years to do this kind of research, I'd certainly get on to Central America. But you can't do everything, Brendan. But I would, I'm always happy if people sort of approach me and say, look, I've got this data set, and how would I go about analyzing it? And I think one of the things that everyone who starts doing or starts thinking about supposed myths and legends and their likely empirical base is you've got to understand that the people who created these stories were not fantasists. They were not myth makers in the sense that we use that term today. They were people who were seriously trying to understand their world and their place in it, and the meaning and the causes of particular events, particularly extreme events, in exactly the same way as we do today. Mm-hmm. It's just that their worldview was different, so that when, thousands of years later, we read their analysis of what was happening thousands of years ago, we think, oh, how incredibly naive, giants and mermaids and things like that. We think this is fantasy. These people were, created stories to entertain themselves and to entertain people after that. But I think that's all complete nonsense. I really do. I don't think anyone, 5,000 years ago had the time to create stories and to write fiction in the way that people invent things today. I think they were pragmatists. And the one thing that drove them, and we see this in Australian cultures, the one thing that drove them was the survival of their bloodline. If you didn't teach your children everything that you knew and your ancestors had passed down to you, your children's chance of survival was reduced as a consequence. So you told stories, you sang songs, you drew pictures in the sand or on the rocks. You took the knowledge that you had and you passed it on to them, and you made sure they understood it, because it was about survival. Particularly in places like Australia, where the environment is very harsh, and finding water and finding food and getting through long droughts is something that has always happened. So that kind of knowledge was all about survival. And today we've repurposed a lot of that. So we think today of myths and legends as stories, and we create our own stories, and we've developed a love of narrative, a love of fiction, but I think that's really all repurposing ancient knowledge and the way that it was, or the reasons why it was created in the first place. Sorry, I'm on a bit of a soapbox there, Brendan.
No. It's great. It's great. And I completely agree. And, today we are, there are still significant portions of the population that believe in anthropomorphic gods or an anthropomorphic type of god. It's not like we've divested ourselves of these types of concepts. Some people are very much still on board and ensnared with them, you might say. So it's like we've been trained in the sort of mainstream conventional sort of mode of thinking to conceive of these ancient people as, I think, simpletons, really. Like they were just kind of like, when they weren't sort of, scratching in the dirt, they were making up these ridiculous stories, and we shouldn't take any of that seriously. So, I'm again very grateful that you've actually completely turned that on its head. And you did mention Scotland, your Scottish grandmother. What else about Scotland have you learned that really has struck you as remarkable in this work?
Well, it's really, in Scotland, you have two types of stories. You have stories about the ocean rising and covering the land and creating islands where it was just a single landmass before. And you have stories about the land rising above the ocean. And when you look at what has happened over the last 15,000 years or so in Scotland, since the last ice age ended, in some places land has gone up, and in some places land has gone down relative to the sea. And I've identified 15 groups of stories in Scotland. And the ones that talk about the land going down and the sea level rising, and the ones that talk about the land going up and the sea level falling, match perfectly to what actually happened. So I'm using my expertise as a geologist, and I'm saying this is what happened in Scotland in the last 15,000 years. Some bits went up, some bits went down. And if you look at these 15 groups of myths, they match perfectly those places. Okay, you don't find any stories of land going down in places where the land went up, and so on and so on. So it's a beautiful demonstration, to me at least, of how these ancient stories are not fictions. They could not possibly be fictions, because it's 15-0, the score sheet. You know, there are 15 groups of stories that match the science perfectly. Okay, if these stories were made up, you'd expect them to be all over the place, but they're not. So to me, they represent authentic memories of what actually happened. And again, we're putting ages on these of 6, 7, 8, 9,000 years ago. Sorry, there's one great story from the Monarch Islands in the Outer Hebrides, and this is a small group of islands off the main coast of a large island called North Uist. And the people in the Monarch Islands in the 1860s, they were visited by someone who was collecting stories, and they told this person, Alexander Carmichael, stories about how the Monarch Islands were once joined to North Uist, and people could walk across backwards and forwards between the two islands. And then the sea rose and it covered the isthmus between the two islands. It covered the area of land. And the stories that the people in the Monarch Islands told included the names of the people who last were able to cross this, and the people who then drowned trying to cross it. So it was clearly a memory that was current amongst the people of the Outer Hebrides, in the 1860s. And we suggest that it's probably about 8,000 years ago that this land connection between those two islands was covered. So, when you scratch the surface of stories in other places, you find that they are of a similar antiquity to well, I haven't talked about the Australian stories, but the Australian stories. So, sorry, Brendan, I'm talking too much.
No, don't apologize. It's very, very interesting. So, the overcoming of preconceptions was something that you mentioned earlier, and because there seems to be this dichotomy of, on the one hand, we're in the mainstream world, we're encouraged to think of the world as being, the world now is the way it was, 5,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. Like, there's this static sort of view that we are encouraged on some level to adopt, and like things could have been a little bit different, but not that different. But here you are, and anyone doing this kind of work is showing that things are actually radically different. And one thing I wanted to ask before we get to, and this might lead into the Australian stuff, but maybe you could outline sort of the basics of the sea level change, the sea level rising, and give just a little bit of a timeline on it in a general sense for people.
Absolutely. So 20,000 years ago, there were lots of people around in many different parts of the earth. 20,000 years ago was the coldest time of the last ice age, which began about 90,000 years ago and ended about 10,000 years ago. But 20,000 years ago was the coldest time of the last ice age, and there were thick ice sheets that covered most of Canada, most of the northern parts of Asia. And in order to create those ice sheets on land, the water came from the oceans. So when the ice sheets formed on the land, the ocean levels dropped as a result. So not only was it really cold 20,000 years ago in most parts of the world, but also the ocean surface was around 125, just over 400 feet lower than it is today. So the geography of the Ice Age world was quite different to what it is today. Yeah, what are today islands off the coast were joined to adjacent islands or to adjacent mainlands, and there was a lot more land around. Unfortunately, a lot of it was too cold for people and other creatures to actually move across. So 20,000 years ago, that was the coldest time of the last ice age, and then things started to warm up, and they warmed up quite quickly in geological terms. So most of the ice was melted by around 6,000 years ago, and the sea level, the ocean surface, had risen by the same 125 meters, the same 410 feet or so that it had fallen before the Ice Age. So there was a very rapid rise of the ocean surface, a rise of sea level that drowned many of the fringes of the land. And there were people on those lands. And one of the things that my research is showing clearly is that the ocean surface rose this 125 meters between about 15,000 and about 6,000 years ago. So in around 9,000 years, it rose a massive amount, and it disrupted generation after generation after generation of coastal dwellers in almost every part of the world. And it created trauma. And that trauma has come down to us today in the forms of stories about dramatic sea level rise and the way people perceived its causes. And we've got some great stories from a couple of places in Australia that recall people thinking the ocean is going to keep rising and eventually it's going to cover the entire land and we're all going to die. So what can we do about this? Okay, so just as sea level is rising today and we talk about, well, what can we do about it? People 8,000 years ago were doing the same thing. Sea level had been rising for thousands of years. It was causing all sorts of problems to embryonic human societies in every part of the world. And people were therefore thinking, well, what can we do about this? And it's really interesting to explore this.
No, it is. I mean, very interesting. I was reading your article today with was it Margaret Cook, co-written with Margaret? And that's it. So I've got some of this a little bit fresh in my mind. And I'd love to dig into some of the Australian stories, because they seem to be some of the more ancient ones that you've uncovered. And I mean, I love the timeline. It pushes things so far back in terms of, that oral tradition and their knowledge base is insanely ancient. I mean, we know there's a general belief that they've been here for tens of thousands of years, but I mean, you can now show at least 10,000 worth of oral tradition from the looks of things. So maybe let's segue into Australia, because that seems to be, you seem to have the view that it's a bit of a unique entity, Australia, in the grand scheme of things.
I think it is, yes, because people probably arrived in Australia about 70,000 years ago, and since that time, up until the year 1788, when Europeans settled Australia, for most of that 70,000 years, people have remained comparatively isolated in Australia, because there's a big ocean gap all the way around. So what that means in terms of cultural evolution is that the culture evolved on its own terms, without being influenced by people coming in from elsewhere and imposing their own culture and their own stories and their own memories and worldviews on indigenous Australian cultures. So that's the first thing that I think is important about Australia. And there's really nowhere else in the world where you can go back, even more than 10,000 years and say these people were isolated for most of the time that they lived in this particular place. There aren't situations like that. So Australia is unique from that point of view. And look, we now have 33 groups of stories from all the way around Australia, which is a country or a continent the size of the conterminous United States or Europe. And these 33 groups of stories all say essentially the same thing, which is at some point in the past, the coastline, which is here today, was much, much further out to sea. And there was much more land over which people moved. And there are many indigenous Aboriginal communities in Australia that have names for places and histories of places that are now under the ocean, which supports this kind of thing. But these stories talk about when the shoreline was further out to sea, when what are today islands offshore were joined to the mainland, when things were quite different. And if you look at the history of Australia since the last ice age, the rise in the ocean surface caused by the melting of the land ice sheets has caused Australia to shrink by almost a quarter. It's about 23% of land lost. And in some places, the coastline has moved in thousands of kilometers, sorry, I think in kilometers and not miles, but thousands of kilometers inland. So the geography of the Australian coastline has changed profoundly in the last 20,000 years or so. And this, of course, had impacts on people, particularly those who lived close to the coast. And that, I think, represents the kind of multi-generational trauma that people felt and therefore led to them encoding their experiences in oral traditions, many of which have come down to us today. And that brings me to the second point about Australia, which is that it's a very, very harsh environment. So the imperative of teaching your children or giving them all the knowledge that you have to assist their survival, to optimize their chances of survival is huge. Okay, if you don't tell your children about what happens during a drought, when they experience a drought, they'll all die. So it's a simple equation. So the oral traditions in Australia, which include geography and history and all sorts of practical knowledge, place-based, is really a feature, a conspicuous feature of Australian society. And we know from ethnographic reports that this was something that was taken very seriously. So rather than the sort of the jolly sort of storytelling around the campfire, it may have been around a campfire, but it was solid instruction. You had to know these stories, you had to know them, and to test your knowledge, you had to repeat them to, your cousins, and your cousins tested you and backwards and forwards. So it was like an examination system. So seriously did people take that knowledge. And I think that really explains the replication fidelity, the idea that these stories have been passed down for thousands and thousands of years, hardly changing at all in terms of their content. And then coming back to your last point, how can we know how old these stories are? Sea level or the ocean surface reached its present level around Australia about 7,000 years ago. It's different to Europe, it's different to other places. So we have really, really good evidence that 7,000 years ago, the ocean surface around Australia was about the same as it is today. So it follows that any stories that talk about when the ocean surface was lower and the coastline further out must be more than 7,000 years old. And we've looked at these 33 groups of stories, and we've said, okay, this story refers to a time in this place when the shoreline was 20 meters lower than it is today. When was the last time that condition was met? Oh, the last time that condition was met was 9,300 years ago, for example. So we are able to put ages, minimum ages, on each of these 33 groups of stories. And you're absolutely right. They show that these stories date from roughly about 7,000 years ago to an incredible 13,000 years ago in some places, particularly around the Great Barrier Reef. I always emphasize, Brendan, that these are not precise numbers. They are the best possible estimates that we can give based on the data that is available. And no one is pretending, least of all me, that they are written in stone. But at the same time, so what? I mean, if they're wrong by a few hundred, even 1,000 years, it doesn't really matter that much, because the overall point is that stories in the Australian context have endured, demonstrably endured, for thousands and thousands of years.
Yeah, and you were talking about, Scotland and Fiji, where these different groups of communities have these different interlocking, complementary stories that all fit together, these puzzle pieces that fit together. So it's very hard to argue with that kind of thing. It's very persuasive, I guess, unless you have some kind of very strong pre-existing bias against this type of perspective. You'll find the full video and any bonus materials in my exclusive members-only portal, the Truthiversity. This unique creation is the official home for all my multimedia research and entertainment content. Updated regularly, my members get access to absolutely everything I create, including full podcasts, courses, articles, videos, audio files, the whole enchilada. Book your spot at truthiversity.com.